They had learned, long before they crossed the threshold of that room, to expect nothing generous from history. War had conditioned them to anticipate judgment delivered without nuance, verdicts shaped by flags rather than faces. For years, they had existed inside a narrowing corridor of outcomes: defeat, disgrace, silence. Even survival had not felt like reprieve, only postponement. When the fighting ended and uniforms were folded away, the weight of what they represented did not lift. It hardened. They were men associated with loss on a continental scale, with cities reduced to rubble and lives extinguished by decisions made far above their reach. Wherever they went, memory arrived first, ahead of their names, ahead of their individual stories. The journey to this moment had been marked by restraint. Words were chosen carefully, gestures kept minimal, emotions held in check not out of discipline alone but out of self-preservation. In the aftermath of total war, excess feeling was dangerous. To speak too freely risked misunderstanding. To remain silent risked erasure. These men had been shaped by that tension. Some had worn uniforms with pride once, others with reluctance, but all now shared the same expectation, that they would be met with cold formality at best, moral dismissal at worst. They had prepared themselves for eyes that would look past them rather than at them, for an atmosphere heavy with unspoken blame. The room itself seemed to confirm their fears. It bore the quiet authority of Britain at war's end, orderly, restrained, still standing. The walls carried the confidence of a nation that had endured bombardment without occupation, that had paid dearly yet emerged on the winning side of history's ledger. British uniforms were present not as symbols of aggression, but of continuity. They suggested an empire that had bent but not broken, an institutional memory stretching back centuries. For those entering the space, that presence was intimidating in its composure. There was no visible triumph, but neither was there uncertainty. This was the calm of those who believed their cause had been just. In such a setting, the men felt the accumulated weight of Europe's devastation press inward. The war had redrawn borders, erased governments, and unsettled the moral frameworks that had once ordered public life. Nothing about this gathering could be separated from that broader collapse. Every chair, every measured step across the floor, existed within the shadow of millions dead and displaced. The men understood that they were not simply individuals in a room, they were embodiments of a past that many would rather condemn than examine. Their presence alone raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility, complicity, and the difference between belief and obedience. They had expected the first moments to confirm this imbalance. A sharp tone, perhaps. A reminder of defeat. Something that would reassert the hierarchy established by victory. Instead, what greeted them was restraint. Not the strained politeness of obligation, but a deliberate withholding of judgment. The British response did not arrive loudly or theatrically. It came through posture, pacing, and an absence that was immediately felt, the absence of hostility. This was not what the men had rehearsed themselves for. Hostility could be endured. It fit the narrative they had been living inside since the war turned against them. This quiet attentiveness did not. Time seemed to stretch as the realization settled in. No one rushed to define them solely by the uniforms they had once worn. No one reduced them to symbols of an enemy that had already been defeated. Instead, there was an almost unsettling patience, as though the room itself was waiting, listening, weighing something more than allegiance. The men became acutely aware of their own breathing, of the sound of fabric shifting as they stood or sat. Small details took on exaggerated significance because the expected confrontation had not materialized. The war had taught everyone involved to think in absolutes. Friend and enemy. Victory and defeat. Right and wrong. These categories had been necessary during the fighting. Without them, cohesion would have collapsed. But here, in this room, those categories felt suddenly insufficient. The British presence did not deny the reality of what had happened, nor did it soften the consequences of loss. Yet it introduced a distinction that had been rare during the conflict, the separation of human experience from ideological cause. That distinction hovered unspoken, but it was unmistakable. For the men, this created a disorienting sense of vulnerability. To be despised would have confirmed what they had come to believe about their place in the post-war world. To be ignored would have been worse. But to be regarded with a seriousness that implied complexity, this was something else entirely. It required them to confront their own memories without the shield of anticipated rejection. The armor they had built from expectation began, slowly, to crack. The silence that filled the room was not empty. It was dense with implication. It suggested that what mattered in this moment was not performance or confession, but acknowledgement. The British officials present seemed acutely aware of the historical gravity of the encounter. Their restraint was not passive, it was chosen. It reflected a confidence that did not need to assert itself through humiliation. This, too, was a product of the war, a lesson learned through endurance rather than conquest. Outside the room, the world was rebuilding in fragments. Rail lines were being repaired, governments reformed, displaced populations resettled with varying degrees of success and compassion. Inside, something quieter was unfolding. A recalibration of expectation. The men had arrived prepared to be judged solely as remnants of a defeated force. Instead, they found themselves occupying a space where judgment was suspended long enough for something more difficult to emerge: recognition. This recognition did not offer comfort. It did not promise forgiveness or absolution, but it acknowledged reality in its full weight. That the war had consumed individuals as well as nations. That participation did not always equate to belief. That survival itself carried its own burdens. In that acknowledgement, the men sensed a shift, not in how history would record the war, but in how its aftermath might be lived. They stood at an uneasy intersection between past and future. The war was over, but its moral accounting was far from complete. The British restraint suggested an understanding that this accounting could not be resolved through silence imposed by power alone. It required moments like this, where expectation was disrupted and inherited narratives were briefly set aside. The men felt the gravity of that realization even if they could not yet articulate it. What unsettled them most was the sense of being truly seen. Not as representatives of an ideology, but as people who had been caught within it. This did not erase responsibility, but it reframed it. It placed individual experience back into a story that had grown too vast, too impersonal. The room, with its quiet order and measured presence, became a place where that reframing could occur without spectacle. As the moment continued, the men understood that whatever followed would matter less than this initial reversal of expectation. The war had conditioned them to brace for impact. Instead, they encountered stillness. And in that stillness, the assumptions they carried, about how they would be received, how the victors would behave, how history would speak to them, began to loosen their grip. This was not reconciliation. It was not closure. It was the opening of a space where certainty faltered and complexity asserted itself. The silence that settled over the room marked the beginning of that process. It was the sound of old narratives pausing, of moral certainty giving way to something more fragile and more demanding. For the men who had entered expecting scorn or dismissal, it was the first indication that the end of the war did not have to mean the end of their humanity. They had prepared themselves for a reaction that would be immediate and unmistakable. Long before the room came into view, before the measured faces and composed posture of the British officials, they had rehearsed the moment internally. Each man carried a private script shaped by years of conditioning, one that assumed the worst because the worst had become familiar. In war and in defeat, predictability was a form of safety. Hostility could be endured because it fit the pattern they knew. Indifference could be survived because it required nothing from them. What they feared most, though they rarely admitted it, was being reduced to something less than human, flattened into a symbol that could be dismissed without effort. The war had taught them how easily that reduction could happen. Once the machinery of conflict began to turn, individuality became an inconvenience. Orders were followed, roles were assigned, and moral complexity was sacrificed for speed and cohesion. For those who stood in this room now, the memory of that process remained vivid. Some had entered the war with conviction, others with resignation, but all had watched as personal identity dissolved into collective purpose. When the tide turned and defeat followed, the same process occurred in reverse. They were no longer soldiers fulfilling duty, they became embodiments of failure, of a cause judged and condemned in its entirety. This was the context they carried with them as they faced the British presence. They expected to be spoken about rather than spoken to, judged as a group rather than acknowledged as individuals. In the aftermath of such a devastating conflict, there was little patience for nuance. Public narratives demanded clarity and closure. Heroes and villains were easier to remember than complicated truths. The men understood that they occupied an uncomfortable position within that narrative, too visible to ignore, too inconvenient to fully confront. In many ways, they had already been sentenced by history. The destruction associated with their side of the war was undeniable. Cities reduced to ash, civilian populations shattered, moral lines crossed beyond repair. They did not deny this reality, but they had lived within it in ways that outsiders often misunderstood. The difference between decision-makers and those who carried out decisions was rarely acknowledged in the public imagination. Uniforms erased that distinction. Flags blurred it further. They had learned not to expect that anyone would care to separate one from the other. As they waited for the moment to unfold, they braced themselves for language that would be sharp and definitive. They anticipated reminders of guilt, perhaps delivered indirectly through tone or implication rather than explicit accusation. Even a polite dismissal would have confirmed what they believed about their place in the post-war order. They were prepared to accept that outcome because preparation had been their shield. Expecting rejection made it survivable. Instead, the first signs of response unsettled them precisely because they lacked that clarity. There was no immediate assertion of superiority, no verbal framing that cast them in a predetermined role. The British officials did not rush to define the encounter. They did not fill the space with rhetoric or moral declaration. This restraint created an unexpected vacuum, one that forced the men to confront the situation without the buffer of hostility. The absence of scorn was not the same as approval, and the men understood that instinctively. Yet it disrupted the emotional architecture they had built around the moment. Without condemnation to push against, they felt exposed. Their rehearsed defenses, silence, detachment, emotional withdrawal, suddenly felt inadequate. They were being asked, implicitly, to stand without the protection of low expectations. This shift carried a quiet power. It suggested that the British response was guided by something other than impulse or triumph. There was an underlying deliberateness to the way the moment unfolded, as though the participants on the other side were aware of the symbolic weight of their behavior. In a world still raw from loss, restraint itself became a statement. It implied that victory did not require humiliation, and that moral confidence could be expressed through control rather than spectacle. For the men, this realization stirred a complicated mix of relief and unease. Relief, because the anticipated hostility did not materialize. Unease, because the encounter now demanded more of them emotionally. To be met with scorn would have allowed them to retreat inward, to confirm their belief that dialogue was futile. To be met with measured attention forced them to remain present, to acknowledge that they were being considered rather than dismissed. The room began to feel less like a tribunal and more like a space of evaluation, one not governed by slogans or inherited judgments, but by a quieter assessment of human experience. This was unfamiliar territory. War had been loud, decisive, relentless. Its aftermath, at least in this moment, unfolded differently. The British presence suggested a willingness to differentiate between responsibility and identity, between actions taken under duress and ideologies that had driven the conflict. This distinction was not articulated openly, but it was embedded in the tone of the encounter. The men became acutely aware of their own assumptions. They had arrived convinced that respect was impossible, that any acknowledgement of their suffering would be interpreted as moral weakness by the victors. The restraint they encountered challenged that belief. It implied that strength could coexist with empathy, and that acknowledging complexity did not diminish the justice of the outcome. This was a difficult idea to absorb, particularly for those who had internalized a worldview shaped by rigid binaries. Silence continued to play a central role. It was not the silence of suppression or fear, but of deliberation. In that quiet, the men sensed that they were being granted something rare in the immediate aftermath of war, time. Time to exist without being instantly categorized. Time to be present without being defined solely by past allegiance. This temporal pause felt almost luxurious, given how relentlessly the war had compressed time into a series of urgent decisions and irreversible consequences. The men also understood the risk inherent in this approach. To acknowledge their humanity could be misinterpreted by others as an attempt to soften historical judgment. They knew that public memory was unforgiving, and that any deviation from clear condemnation could provoke backlash. That the British officials were willing to accept that risk, even implicitly, added weight to the moment. It suggested a long view of history, one that valued understanding alongside accountability. As the encounter continued, the men felt the internal tension begin to shift. Their fear did not vanish, but it transformed. It became less about rejection and more about exposure. Without Scorn to push against, they were left to confront their own memories, their own sense of responsibility, without the simplifying pressure of external condemnation. This was harder in many ways. It required honesty rather than endurance. They became aware that they were participating in a subtle moral exchange. The British restraint was not passive, it invited reflection. It challenged the men to consider how they saw themselves, not just how they expected to be seen. The war had forced them into roles that left little room for introspection. Now, in its aftermath, that introspection was unavoidable. The absence of immediate judgment did not absolve them, but it did something equally significant. It restored a measure of agency. They were no longer merely objects of history's verdict, but participants in its ongoing interpretation. This realization was both empowering and unsettling. It suggested that the story was not finished, that the moral meaning of the war would continue to evolve through moments like this one. As they stood or sat in that room, surrounded by the quiet authority of British endurance, the men recognized that their expectations had been shaped as much by fear as by experience. The war had taught them to expect extremes. What they encountered instead was moderation, and within that moderation, a deeper challenge. To be seen without contempt was to be reminded of what they had lost, not only in terms of outcome, but in terms of moral clarity. The encounter did not resolve these tensions. It deepened them. Yet in doing so, it opened a path away from the simplistic narratives that had dominated the war years. The men began to understand that the absence of Scorn was not an accident, but a deliberate choice. A choice that reflected an understanding of war not just as a contest of arms, but as a human catastrophe whose aftermath demanded more than punishment. In this space of measured response, the men found themselves confronting a reality they had not anticipated. They were not being asked to defend themselves, nor were they being dismissed outright. They were being allowed to exist within the moral aftermath of the war without being immediately erased. This, in itself, was a profound reversal of expectation. The moment remained unresolved, suspended between past and future. But the men sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The war had conditioned them to expect only extremes. What they encountered instead was restraint, and within that restraint, the possibility that history's judgment, while unavoidable, did not have to be devoid of humanity. As the encounter progressed, the atmosphere in the room changed in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. What had begun as cautious restraint slowly deepened into something more deliberate, more searching. The British officials did not simply maintain their composure, they engaged with the moment as if aware that history itself was present, listening. Their attention was focused, not performative. It suggested that this was not a procedural necessity to be dispatched quickly, but an encounter that carried moral weight beyond its immediate participants. For the men who had arrived braced for dismissal, this shift was disorienting. They had prepared themselves to endure, not to be acknowledged. Recognition emerged gradually, without ceremony. It did not arrive as praise or absolution, but as a careful distinction, one that separated human experience from the ideologies that had driven the war. This distinction was powerful precisely because it resisted simplification. The British response acknowledged suffering without endorsing cause, endurance without validating allegiance. In doing so, it challenged the foundational logic of wartime thinking, which had demanded total identification between soldier and ideology. Here, That bond was loosened, if only slightly, allowing individual experience to surface. For the men, this recognition carried a weight that was difficult to articulate. They had lived for years under the assumption that their suffering would be dismissed as irrelevant or deserved. The dominant narrative of the war left little room for acknowledging pain on the defeated side without appearing to relativize the conflict's moral stakes. Yet the British approach navigated this tension with precision. It did not deny responsibility or obscure the catastrophic consequences of the war. Instead, it acknowledged that suffering was not a finite resource, nor one confined neatly along national lines. This acknowledgement altered the emotional geometry of the room. The men felt the rigid boundaries they had internalized begin to soften. They were no longer standing solely as representatives of a defeated force, but as individuals whose lives had been shaped, often irreversibly, by decisions made within a vast and impersonal system. This did not erase accountability, but it reframed it. Responsibility was no longer a blunt instrument wielded indiscriminately. It became something that could be examined, weighed, and understood in context. The silence that followed this shift was profound. It was not the awkward pause of uncertainty, but a collective stillness born of recognition. Those present seemed to sense that something fragile was unfolding, something that could not be rushed or articulated without diminishing its significance. In that silence, assumptions collapsed quietly. The men realized that they were witnessing a moment where the inherited narratives of the war were being tested, not rejected outright, but subjected to a deeper moral scrutiny. This silence also functioned as a mirror. It reflected back to everyone present the cost of years spent thinking in absolutes. War had required clarity at the expense of complexity. It had demanded loyalty without hesitation and obedience without reflection. Now, in its aftermath, the limitations of that framework were exposed. The British recognition suggested that moral clarity did not have to mean moral rigidity, and that acknowledging complexity was not a betrayal of justice but an extension of it. For the men, this realization was unsettling. It forced them to confront aspects of their own experience that had been buried beneath layers of survival and self-protection. During the war, introspection had been a liability. Doubt could undermine cohesion. Reflection could slow action. Those habits did not disappear when the fighting ended. Many had carried them into peace, clinging to simplified narratives because they offered emotional stability. Now, those narratives were being gently, but firmly, challenged. The British officials appeared acutely aware of the moral asymmetry of the situation. They spoke and acted from a position of victory, yet their approach avoided triumphalism. This restraint was not accidental. It reflected a recognition that victory itself carried responsibility, not only to remember the dead and honor sacrifice, but to shape the post-war moral landscape. How the victors behaved would influence how the war was remembered, and how peace would be constructed from its ruins. By acknowledging suffering without erasing culpability, the British response modeled a form of moral maturity forged through prolonged conflict. Britain's own losses had been immense. Cities had burned, families shattered, futures altered irrevocably. Yet this recognition of shared human cost did not diminish those losses. Instead, it contextualized them within a broader tragedy that transcended national boundaries. The war, in this framing, was not a morality play with neatly assigned roles, but a catastrophe that consumed lives across divisions. The men sensed this reframing intuitively. It did not make their past easier to bear, but it made it more comprehensible. They were no longer trapped within a narrative that allowed only shame or denial. Recognition offered a third possibility: acknowledgement without justification, memory without erasure. This possibility was fragile, easily misunderstood, yet deeply significant. As the moment unfolded, the silence deepened rather than dissipated. It became a shared space where reflection replaced reaction. No one rushed to fill it with explanation or defense. The absence of speech allowed the weight of what was being acknowledged to settle fully. For the men, this was perhaps the most unexpected element of all. War had been relentless in its demands, leaving no room for pause. Here, the pause itself became meaningful. In that quiet, the men became aware of parallels they had long resisted. The British officials before them had also endured fear, loss, and uncertainty. They too had lived under bombardment, made decisions under pressure, and watched comrades fall. The difference lay not in the presence or absence of suffering, but in the outcome of the conflict and the moral framework through which it would be remembered. Recognition did not collapse this difference, but it acknowledged the shared human substrate beneath it. This realization did not produce comfort so much as clarity. It stripped away the protective illusion that suffering belonged exclusively to one side or the other. It also exposed the inadequacy of narratives that relied solely on blame to explain the war's devastation. Blame was necessary, but it was not sufficient. Understanding required a willingness to confront how ordinary people became instruments of extraordinary destruction. The men felt the emotional toll of this confrontation. To be recognized was to be seen, and to be seen was to be reminded of everything they had endured and everything they had lost. The silence allowed memories to surface, moments of fear, of doubt, of moral compromise. These memories had been suppressed not because they were insignificant, but because they were overwhelming. Recognition gave them permission to exist without immediate judgment, but it also removed the comfort of anonymity. For the British officials, the moment carried its own burden. To extend recognition was to accept the complexity of the war's legacy. It meant resisting the temptation to simplify history for the sake of national myth-making. This was not an easy choice. Nations emerging from war often rely on simplified narratives to rebuild cohesion and pride. Yet the restraint displayed here suggested a different path, one that acknowledged moral complexity as a strength rather than a weakness. The silence persisted because it marked a threshold. On one side lay the wartime logic of total opposition. On the other lay a post-war reality that demanded reconciliation with uncomfortable truths. The room existed briefly at that threshold, suspended between what had been necessary during the conflict and what would be required to move beyond it. The men sensed that they were participants in this transition, whether they wished to be or not. Recognition in this context was not a conclusion but an opening. It did not resolve the moral questions raised by the war, nor did it diminish the need for accountability. Instead, it reframed those questions in a way that allowed for depth rather than dogma. The men began to understand that being recognized did not mean being excused. It meant being acknowledged as part of a human tragedy rather than reduced to a symbol of it. As the silence slowly eased, its impact lingered. The men carried with them the awareness that something rare had occurred. Expectations had been overturned not through dramatic gesture, but through deliberate restraint and moral clarity. The British respect they encountered was not sentimental, it was sober, grounded in the understanding that the war's legacy would shape generations to come. In that realization, the room became more than a physical space. It became a moment of historical recalibration, where the rigid narratives of conflict loosened enough to allow complexity to breathe. The men left this moment changed, not absolved, not redeemed, but seen. And in the long shadow of the war, that recognition carried a weight that would endure far beyond the silence in which it was first felt. What unfolded next carried a different kind of gravity, one that went beyond recognition and entered the far more precarious territory of moral risk. The atmosphere in the room had already shifted, but now it deepened, acquiring a sense of consequence that everyone present could feel. Respect, once offered, could not be withdrawn without cost. It altered the balance of the encounter, placing responsibility not only on those who received it, but on those who extended it. In the aftermath of a war defined by uncompromising judgments, this was a dangerous choice. To treat former enemies with dignity risked misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and even condemnation from those who demanded a harsher reckoning. The British officials understood this risk. They were not naive about the public mood beyond the room's walls. Across Europe, grief was raw and anger unresolved. Entire populations were struggling to make sense of what they had endured, and moral clarity felt like a necessity rather than a luxury. In such an environment, restraint could be mistaken for weakness and empathy for betrayal. Yet the posture they maintained suggested an awareness that the work of peace required different tools than the work of war. Victory had settled the question of power. It had not settled the question of meaning. By choosing respect over humiliation, The British response rejected the simplicity of vengeance. It acknowledged that punishment alone could not account for the war's complexity, nor could it restore what had been lost. This did not mean that crimes were forgotten or responsibility diluted. Instead, it reflected an understanding that moral accounting after catastrophe demanded precision, not broad strokes. To condemn indiscriminately was to replicate, in a quieter form, the same erasure of individuality that war itself had enforced. For the men at the center of the moment, this realization was unsettling in ways they had not anticipated. Respect carried with it an implicit challenge. It removed the refuge of victimhood and the shield of collective guilt. If they were to be treated as individuals, then they would also be expected to confront their own histories as individuals. The binary logic that had governed the war years, us versus them, right versus wrong, had offered a kind of emotional shelter. It simplified responsibility and distributed it evenly across groups. The British approach disrupted that shelter. The room felt heavier as this implication settled in. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of surprise. It was reflective, even burdensome. Each man was left alone with his memories, without the comforting certainty that judgment would be swift and external. Respect demanded introspection. It required them to consider not only what had been done to them, but what they themselves had done or allowed to be done. This was a far more difficult reckoning than enduring condemnation from others. The British officials, for their part, were navigating their own moral tension. They were representatives of a nation that had suffered greatly and prevailed at enormous cost. Their authority rested not only on victory, but on the moral legitimacy of their cause. By extending respect to those once cast as enemies, they were testing the resilience of that legitimacy. They were asserting that their moral confidence was strong enough to withstand complexity, that acknowledging humanity on the other side did not weaken their own claim to justice. This approach reflected lessons learned through years of sustained conflict. Britain's survival had depended not on ideological purity alone, but on endurance, compromise, and the ability to adapt under pressure. The war had exposed the limits of absolutism. Alliances had shifted, strategies revised, moral lines strained by necessity. In that context, the post-war moment demanded a reckoning that acknowledged those strains rather than erasing them. The respect shown in the room was an extension of that wartime realism into peace. The men began to sense that they were witnessing a form of strength they had not fully understood before. It was not the strength of dominance or certainty, but of restraint and moral patience. This strength did not announce itself loudly. It operated quietly, through the refusal to simplify and the willingness to sit with discomfort. For men conditioned by years of coercion, propaganda, and fear, this was a disarming contrast. The silence in the room became a shared burden. It forced everyone present to confront the limits of their own narratives. The British officials could no longer rely solely on the clarity of victory to define their moral position. The men could no longer rely on the certainty of rejection to define theirs. Both sides were exposed to a more demanding form of honesty, one that resisted closure and demanded ongoing reflection. This exposure revealed uncomfortable parallels. The war had required obedience, sacrifice, and the suppression of doubt on all sides. It had rewarded conformity and punished hesitation. In its aftermath, those habits lingered, shaping how people remembered and explained their actions. The British respect offered in the room challenged those habits. It suggested that the time for unquestioning allegiance had passed, and that the future would require a more nuanced engagement with the past. For the men, this meant confronting the ways in which they had navigated moral compromise. Some had justified their actions as duty, others as inevitability, still others as survival. Respect did not invalidate these explanations, but it placed them under scrutiny. Without the simplifying force of condemnation, the men were left to examine their own choices with greater clarity. This examination was painful, but it was also humanizing. It acknowledged that moral failure did not require monstrosity, only circumstance combined with fear and conformity. The British officials were equally implicated in this process. Their respect signaled a refusal to distance themselves entirely from the war's moral ambiguities. Britain's cause had been just, but its path had not been free of compromise. Civilians had died under British bombs, alliances had been forged with morally troubling partners, and decisions had been made under extreme pressure. By acknowledging humanity across former lines of conflict, the British implicitly acknowledged that moral purity was a wartime fiction sustained by necessity rather than reality. This mutual, unspoken acknowledgement deepened the silence. It transformed the room into a space of shared vulnerability, where certainty gave way to responsibility. No one spoke because speech risked collapsing the fragile equilibrium. Words could too easily reassert familiar narratives or retreat into defensive justifications. Silence allowed the complexity to remain intact, unflattened by explanation. The men felt the emotional toll of this moment accumulate. To be respected was to be burdened with expectation, not of redemption, but of honesty. They could no longer hide behind the idea that history had already condemned them in total. Respect implied that history was still listening, still capable of differentiation. This realization was both daunting and, in an unexpected way, affirming. It suggested that their lives, even after defeat, still mattered enough to be examined carefully. Outside the room, the post-war world was hungry for certainty. Trials were underway, borders redrawn, narratives solidified. There was little appetite for ambiguity in public discourse. Yet inside, a different approach was being tested. It did not reject accountability, but it insisted that accountability be precise rather than symbolic. It sought to distinguish between systems and individuals, between ideology and lived experience. This approach did not offer emotional release. There was no catharsis, no moment of collective absolution or condemnation. Instead, it imposed a quieter, more enduring burden, the responsibility to remember accurately. For the men, this meant carrying forward a memory of the war that resisted both self-exoneration and total self-condemnation. For the British officials, it meant shaping a legacy of victory that included humility as well as pride. As the moment stretched on, it became clear that what was taking place was not reconciliation, but recalibration. Moral boundaries were being redrawn, not erased. The war's outcome remained unchanged, as did its fundamental judgments. But within those judgments, space was being made for human complexity. This space was fragile, easily misunderstood, yet essential if the peace was to be more than a pause between conflicts. The silence eventually eased, but it did not dissipate. It lingered in posture, in expression, in the careful way the moment concluded. Those present understood, without needing it stated, that something significant had occurred. A choice had been made to resist the easy satisfaction of moral certainty in favor of a more demanding honesty. For the men, this choice altered the landscape of their post-war existence. They would still live with loss, stigma, and unresolved guilt. But they had been shown that dignity could survive defeat, and that acknowledgement did not have to mean denial. For the British, the moment affirmed a different kind of victory, one that asserted moral confidence not through domination, but through restraint. In the long shadow of the war, such moments were rare. They did not attract attention or inspire slogans. Yet their impact was enduring. They shaped how history was lived, not just how it was written. In that room, amid silence and measured respect, the moral aftermath of the war took a small but significant step away from vengeance and toward understanding, without pretending that understanding alone could heal what had been broken. As the encounter moved forward, its impact began to register not only as a collective experience, but as an intensely personal one for the men at its center. The respect they had encountered did not dissipate once the immediate silence eased. Instead, it followed them inward, reshaping how they understood themselves within the aftermath of the war. For years, they had lived under the assumption that their identities were fixed by defeat, that whatever remained of their lives would unfold beneath a permanent shadow. Now, that assumption was being quietly challenged, not by reassurance or forgiveness, but by the simple fact of being taken seriously as human beings. This shift was subtle, yet it carried profound psychological weight. The men realized that the British response had not been an act of courtesy, but an invitation, one that demanded something in return. Respect, offered without sentimentality, imposed responsibility. It required them to confront their pasts without the distortions of either self-pity or total self-erasure. They were no longer merely enduring history's judgment. They were being asked, implicitly, to participate in its honest reckoning. For many, this was the first time since the war began that they felt such an expectation placed upon them. During the conflict, moral responsibility had been diluted by hierarchy and necessity. Orders flowed downward, consequences upward. Individual reflection was suppressed in favor of collective survival. Even after defeat, responsibility had remained abstract, framed in terms of nations and systems rather than personal agency. The British respect disrupted that abstraction. It narrowed the focus, bringing responsibility back to the scale of individual lives. This narrowing was uncomfortable. It stripped away the protective distance that collective guilt had provided. To be condemned as part of a defeated group was painful, but it also absolved the individual of deeper examination. Respect removed that shield. It suggested that the men were capable of reflection, capable of understanding the moral dimensions of their own actions. This expectation was demanding, but it was also humanizing. It treated them not as remnants of a collapsed system, but as moral agents whose experiences still mattered.